If a patient asks about assisted dying, what laws currently apply at the moment?
So as the law currently stands, any individual will be committing an offence under Section 2 of the 1961 Suicide Act if they performed an act that was seen as assisting or encouraging the suicide or attempted suicide of another, and the act was done with the intention to assist or encourage the suicide or attempted suicide of another person. So as things stand at the moment, all forms of assisted dying in the UK are illegal, and that can range from, for example, providing the drug to an individual to end their life, all the way to even simply travelling with them to an assisted dying facility abroad.
So what should a clinician do if a patient wants to discuss assisted dying with them?
That's a very interesting question, because the likelihood is that some doctors have been in that situation where a patient has raised their wish to end their life. Now, the British Medical Association does provide some advice in terms of how that conversation should be managed, and their advice is to deal with the conversation compassionately, sensitively, and non-judgmentally. The reason for that is because if there is a patient who's come to the point where they want to end their life, the likelihood is they're quite distressed both mentally and physically. So it's crucial that the doctor or the clinician deals with the conversation in a very careful and sensitive way. But they must also make the legal position in the UK quite clear, and that includes a serious consequence of anyone assisting in their dying, which could include, for example, providing the drug to end their life or travelling with them abroad. Now, there was a case, a Supreme Court case, where the judge provided some advice, and he said effectively that a doctor cannot advise a patient on how they must die, but they can provide objective advice on the medical options available, and that includes things like sedation, palliative care, and in those circumstances, a doctor wouldn't incur criminal liability in circumstances where palliative care would be the appropriate course of action.
Absolutely, I think you're right. What should clinicians be mindful of not doing if a patient asks them about assisted dying?
Again, that's another great question, because in certain circumstances, the difference between what a clinician should be doing and shouldn't be doing could be quite subtle. Now, the BMA does helpfully provide some guidance on what a clinician shouldn't be doing. Some of those examples include providing advice on what a lethal dose is, providing a medical report that could be used to facilitate assisted dying abroad, providing literature on any aspect of assisted dying, or, for example, suggesting assisted dying abroad in a clinic.
I think that's really helpful to have those examples to guide them, isn't it?
Definitely.
Now, one situation that clinicians might find themselves in is patients asking them to provide reports that might help them to organise an assisted suicide or assisted dying abroad.
Yes.
What should clinicians do or not do in that situation?
I'm sure this situation has arisen in relation to one doctor or another. Now, what the doctor or clinician can do is they can provide a response to a legitimate request for information, but that has to be quite factual, and they have to avoid statements that could be interpreted as supporting or facilitating assisted suicide. The factual information they can provide is factual information again about the diagnosis, treatment, functional status, as you would with any request for information, but they must avoid framing the actual report in a way where it can be seen as supporting or recommending assisted suicide. For example, they must also avoid completing a form, and a doctor may be asked to complete a form which could be used in an application process for assisted dying abroad, and generally just advising assisted dying as a medical option. So it all comes down to the information that you provide to the patient and how that could be interpreted. So again, it has to be factual, it has to avoid statements that could be interpreted as or seen as recommending or supporting assisted suicide.
So one situation clinicians might find themselves in is a patient asking for a report which they intend to use to assist them in organising assisted dying or assisted suicide abroad. What should clinicians do and not do in that situation?
when a doctor finds themselves in a position where they're being asked to provide a report, what they can do is they can provide factual information, and they have to avoid including any statements that could be interpreted as recommending or supporting or facilitating assisted suicide. Now, what you can include is factual information about the condition, the diagnosis, and the functional state. But you have, as you would with any request for information, but you must avoid framing the medical report in a way that could be perceived as you're assisting or recommending assisted suicide. And part of that may include avoiding to complete a form, for example, that could be used in an application form for assisted dying. And overall, it's about how the report's framed. You must avoid any statements that could be interpreted as, you know, this doctor is recommending assisted suicide. It has to be factual, and you have to absolutely avoid any statements or comments that could be perceived as, for example, you're giving assisted suicide or assisted dying as a potential medical option.
Okay, so it's not about the intended use of the form or the report, it's more about the information that's being provided within it, is that right?
Yes, of course. So it has to be a legitimate request for information, and the response must be factual summaries of, for example, diagnosis, treatment, and functional status, as you would with any request for a medical report.
Yes, thank you, that's really helpful.
Thank you.